A tiny raccoon's unwavering loyalty to a wounded badger captivated everyone who witnessed it. In the unforgiving wilderness, this unlikely bond defied nature's cruel rules. What drove this small creature to risk everything for another species? No one expected the raccoon's final act would leave witnesses forever changed. This is the story of a loyalty so pure it transcended instinct itself. In the depths of the ancient forest, where sunlight filtered through a canopy of emerald leaves, a tiny raccoon scurried through the dense underbrush. Half the size of others in his species, this little survivor had been abandoned early, forced to navigate the harsh realities of wilderness life alone. The runt of his litter, other raccoons often chased him away from communal feeding grounds, leaving him to forage in less bountiful territories. Nature had dealt him a difficult hand, but what he lacked in size, he made up for in tenacity and resourcefulness that had kept him alive against impossible odds. It was during a particularly desperate search for food after 3 days of near starvation that the raccoon's sensitive ears caught something unusual. A labored breathing, punctuated by soft whimpers of pain that seemed to echo through the otherwise silent forest floor. Most creatures would have fled immediately, their survival instincts overriding any curiosity. Survival in the wild means avoiding trouble, avoiding risk, avoiding anything unknown. Every day was already a gamble with death. But something made this tiny raccoon pause, his whiskers twitching with a curiosity that defied self-preservation. Following the sound, he pushed through thick ferns and navigated around moss-covered logs, his little heart racing with each cautious step. The pained sounds grew louder until finally, he pushed through a curtain of hanging vines to discover a massive badger, once formidable and feared throughout the forest, now lying helplessly on its side in a small clearing. A deep, jagged gash ran across its flank, blood matting the silver-gray fur and seeping into the earth below. The badger's eyes, normally fierce and territorial, were now clouded with pain and vulnerability as they briefly locked with the raccoon's. Even in this weakened state, the badger represented a predator and potential threat, its powerful jaws still capable of crushing the tiny raccoon's skull with a single bite. Every instinct, every lesson the wilderness had taught him, screamed at the tiny raccoon to run, to flee from this dangerous animal that could kill him with a single swipe under normal circumstances. Badgers were known to attack smaller creatures without provocation, their territorial nature making them one of the forest's most feared residents. This was not his problem. This was not his fight. The cruel law of the wild dictated that the weak perish, making room for the strong. It was the way things had always been. Yet, as the wounded badger's breathing grew more labored and a tremor of pain rippled through its massive body, the tiny raccoon did something that defied explanation. Instead of retreating to safety, he inched closer, his small body trembling but determined. His tiny paws left delicate prints in the soft earth as he approached the creature that, under any other circumstance, would have been his executioner. There was no logical reason for his actions, nothing to gain and everything to lose. The badger's eyes, hazy with pain, followed the raccoon's approach with a mixture of confusion and resignation. Too weak to defend itself, the once mighty predator could only watch as the tiny creature drew near, waiting for whatever might come next in its vulnerable state. But what the tiny raccoon couldn't possibly know was that this simple act of compassion, this inexplicable moment of courage, would soon put him in the crosshairs of the forest's deadliest predator. One that had already picked up the scent of blood and was silently making its way toward them both. As twilight descended upon the forest, casting long shadows across the clearing, the tiny raccoon faced a critical decision. The wounded badger's breathing had grown more labored, each exhale a ragged struggle against the inevitable. Most forest creatures had retreated to their dens and nests, seeking shelter from the approaching night and its many dangers. The raccoon should have done the same. Should have followed the ancient wisdom passed down through generations of his kind: survive, avoid danger, look after yourself first. Instead, he began to gather fallen leaves, dragging them one by one to create a makeshift barrier around the badger's massive form. His tiny paws worked tirelessly, building a crude wall against the biting wind that had begun to sweep through the trees. The badger watched through half-lidded eyes, too weak to protest this strange behavior from a creature it would normally chase away without hesitation. Occasionally, the badger would attempt to lift its head, only to collapse back down, a low whimper escaping its throat. A sound so uncharacteristic of the normally stoic predator that it seemed to strengthen the raccoon's resolve. The forest grew quieter as night approached, the usual symphony of birds giving way to the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. These sounds, normally terrifying to the tiny raccoon, barely registered as he continued his work with single-minded determination. His small body, already thin from days of unsuccessful foraging, trembled with exhaustion. Yet he pressed on, driven by something beyond understanding. When the first raindrops began to fall, pattering against the forest canopy like tiny drums, the raccoon's efforts grew more urgent. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wounded badger shivered uncontrollably. Without proper shelter, the night's cold would likely claim the larger animal before dawn. The raccoon chittered anxiously, his dark eyes scanning the surroundings for better protection, using skills he had developed to survive alone in a world that had rejected him. The tiny raccoon located a hollow beneath a nearby fallen log, just large enough for himself. The space was dry and would offer perfect protection from both the rain and potential predators. For a moment, he hesitated, the instinct for self-preservation nearly overwhelming. But rather than taking refuge there, he continued his seemingly futile task of protecting the badger. He scurried back and forth between the hollow and the badger, bringing dry moss and more leaves to cover the wounded animal's body, insulating it against the growing chill. The rain intensified, soon becoming a downpour that drenched the forest floor and transformed gentle streams into rushing torrents. The tiny raccoon's fur clung to his small frame, making him appear even more fragile as he worked. His paws became muddy, his movements slower as exhaustion set in. Yet still, he persisted, occasionally stopping to nudge the badger's snout, as if encouraging it to hold on, to fight, to survive just one more hour. A flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very ground beneath them. The raccoon froze momentarily, his natural fear finally breaking through his determination. For a heartbeat, he considered abandoning his self-appointed mission, fleeing to the safety of the hollow he had found. The badger seemed to sense his hesitation and, with what appeared to be tremendous effort, lifted its massive head slightly, its eyes meeting the raccoon's. Something passed between them in that moment. Something wordless, yet profound. By midnight, the storm had reached its peak. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning illuminated the clearing in harsh, white flashes that cast eerie shadows among the trees. The wind howled through the forest, bending saplings nearly to breaking point and sending loose branches crashing to the ground around them. The raccoon, trembling from cold and fatigue, finally ceased his gathering. In a move that defied all natural instinct, all evolutionary wisdom, he climbed atop the badger's massive form and pressed his tiny body against the larger animal's neck, sharing what little warmth he possessed. The badger, which had watched this strange little creature with confusion and suspicion throughout the long evening, now seemed to understand. With tremendous effort that must have caused excruciating pain, it shifted slightly, creating a small pocket between its body and foreleg, a shelter from the worst of the rain. The raccoon nestled into this space, his tiny heart beating rapidly against the badger's slower, stronger pulse. Through the long hours of the storm, an impossible bond began to form. Two creatures, predator and prey by nature's design, finding unexpected solace in each other's presence. The raccoon occasionally left his shelter to bring water and cupped leaves to the badger, holding them to the larger animal's mouth with delicate paws that shook from exhaustion. The badger, too weak to hunt or drink on its own, accepted this offering, lapping at the collected rainwater with a tongue that could easily have crushed the raccoon's delicate skull. As the night wore on, the badger's breathing grew more erratic. Several times, it seemed to stop altogether, only to resume with a shuddering gasp that sent ripples of fear through the tiny raccoon. During these moments, the raccoon would chitter anxiously, patting the badger's muzzle with his paws as if willing life back into the fading creature. And remarkably, each time, the badger seemed to respond, fighting its way back from the brink. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. The raccoon, despite his exhaustion, remained vigilant, his small body serving as both sentinel and heater for his unlikely companion. Twice during the night, the snapping of twigs in the nearby underbrush announced the presence of potential predators. Once a fox, its eyes gleaming in the darkness, and later, the low growl of something larger, perhaps a mountain lion. Each time, the raccoon tensed, preparing to flee, yet each time he remained, pressing himself closer to the badger, as if his tiny presence might somehow ward off dangers that would normally send him scrambling for the highest tree. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, the tiny raccoon faced a choice that would test the very limits of his courage, one that would make even the wisest forest elders question everything they knew about survival. The storm had passed, but the badger's condition had worsened. The wound, exposed to the elements despite the raccoon's best efforts, had begun to show signs of infection. The flesh around the gash was hot to the touch, angry red lines spreading outward like the roots of a poisonous plant. The larger animal's breathing was shallow, its powerful body occasionally seized by spasms of pain that made the raccoon chitter in distress. The forest was coming alive around them. Birds began their morning songs, deer cautiously emerged from their nighttime hiding places, and insects buzzed with renewed energy. Life was continuing its eternal cycle, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the small clearing. The raccoon could leave now, return to his solitary existence with no one to blame him for abandoning a lost cause. He had already done more than any creature could expect, defying the very laws of nature that dictated each animal look after its own kind. Or he could stay, continuing to risk his life for a creature that, under different circumstances, would have been his enemy. A choice that offered no reward beyond the knowledge that he had not abandoned a suffering being. As sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the unlikely pair, the tiny raccoon made his choice. One that would forever alter the course of both their lives and challenge the very foundations of what the forest inhabitants believed about the boundaries between different species. With renewed determination, he began to search for something that might save his new friend, something that might defy the odds stacked so heavily against them. What he couldn't possibly know was that his actions were being observed by eyes far more dangerous than any predator. Eyes that would soon force the tiny raccoon to make the ultimate sacrifice in a final act of loyalty that would leave an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. The forest awakened fully to the new day, dappled sunlight breaking through the canopy to create shifting patterns on the damp ground. The tiny raccoon, his fur still matted from the previous night's downpour, surveyed the clearing with tired eyes. The badger's condition had deteriorated further. Its breathing was shallow and irregular, the wound now visibly inflamed with angry red streaks spreading outward from the jagged gash. A yellowish discharge had begun to seep from the edges, a sign the raccoon recognized from previous encounters with wounded forest creatures. It was the mark of infection, the harbinger of a slow, painful death if left untreated. Instinct told the raccoon that infection was the enemy now. A silent, invisible predator, more dangerous than any with teeth or claws. His mother, before she was taken by human hunters during his first season, had taught him about the healing properties of certain plants. Though most of her lessons had faded with time and the harsh reality of survival, fragments remained, tucked away in the corners of his memory, like precious seeds waiting for the right moment to germinate. With one last glance at the badger, whose massive body seemed somehow smaller in its vulnerability, the raccoon set off on a desperate mission. His small body, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, moved with renewed purpose through the underbrush. Twigs snapped beneath his paws, and occasionally he would pause, nose twitching as he sampled the air for the distinctive scents he sought. He needed to find something, anything, that might help his unlikely companion. The journey was not without its perils. Twice he had to freeze, pressing his body flat against the forest floor as shadows passed overhead, hawks scanning for an easy meal. Once, he detoured widely around the fresh scent markers of a fox family, unwilling to risk an encounter in his weakened state. Each delay heightened his anxiety, the image of the badger's labored breathing driving him forward despite the dangers. The first discovery came near a sun-drenched embankment where the soil was rich and dark. Yarrow plants with their feathery leaves and white flower clusters stood in a proud cluster, swaying gently in the morning breeze. The raccoon remembered these could help stop bleeding, though that stage had long passed for the badger's wound. Still, his mother had used them for other purposes as well. Something about fighting the heat of infection. He carefully gathered several stems in his mouth, the bitter taste making him wince as he added them to his mental inventory of healing plants. Next, he located a patch of plantain, broad-leaved and unassuming against the forest floor. These, his mother had shown him, could draw out infection when chewed and applied to wounds. The memory came back clearly now, watching her tiny paws mash the leaves into a pulp before applying them to a puncture wound on his sister's flank after an unfortunate encounter with a thorny bush. The raccoon harvested several of the largest leaves, adding them to his growing collection. His search continued throughout the morning, each new find adding to the bundle he was creating. Wild garlic bulbs, pungent and strong, known for their ability to fight infection. He dug several from the soil near a fallen log, the effort causing him to pant with exertion. Strips of pine resin, sticky and aromatic, which could seal wounds and protect them from further contamination. He collected these carefully from a damaged pine trunk, the amber substance clinging stubbornly to his paws as he worked. By midday, the raccoon had ventured farther from the clearing than he had intended, following the course of a small stream in search of more medicinal plants. The water burbled pleasantly over smooth stones, providing welcome relief for his parched throat as he stopped to drink. It was here, in the damp soil beside the stream, that he discovered a small cluster of mushrooms that grew on a fallen oak. Ones his mother had specifically pointed out as medicine, not food. "These heal from within," she had told him, though he hadn't understood her meaning at the time. Now, he carefully harvested several of the fungi, handling them with a reverence that suggested he understood their importance. The final ingredient came in the form of a beehive, hanging low from a branch overhanging the stream. The raccoon eyed it warily, knowing the danger, but also remembering his mother's lessons about the healing properties of honey. With uncharacteristic boldness, he climbed the tree and approached the hive from above, waiting until most of the bees had departed on their daily gathering missions. With quick, precise movements, he reached into a small opening at the bottom of the hive, scooping a handful of the golden liquid before retreating hastily. Several angry bees pursued him, one managing to deliver a painful sting to his shoulder before he plunged into the stream, using the water as a barrier between himself and his pursuers. The sun had reached its zenith by the time the raccoon returned to the clearing, his precious cargo clutched carefully between his teeth, the honey sticky against his chest fur where he had pressed it for safekeeping. The journey back had been arduous, his small body protesting each step, the bee sting throbbing painfully. But none of that mattered when he entered the clearing and saw the badger. The massive creature lay motionless, on its side, eyes closed, no visible rise and fall of its chest. For a heart-stopping moment, the raccoon feared he had returned too late, that death had claimed the badger while he searched for remedies. He dropped his gathered plants and rushed forward, a distressed chitter escaping his throat. Then, almost imperceptibly, the larger animal's chest rose and fell. A shallow breath, but a breath nonetheless. The raccoon froze, watching intently until he saw it happen again, confirmation that life still clung to the badger's massive frame. Working with methodical precision that belied his small size, the raccoon began preparing his remedies. First, he created a small depression in the ground, lining it with broad leaves to form a makeshift mortar. He chewed the plantain leaves into a pulp, his sharp teeth grinding the fibrous material until it formed a green paste. To this, he added the sticky pine resin, using a small stick to mix the two substances together until they formed a thick, adhesive poultice. The wild garlic he crushed between two stones, releasing its pungent oils that made his sensitive nose wrinkle. The yarrow he set aside for later use, knowing it would be needed for a different preparation. The mushrooms he divided into two portions, one to be applied directly to the wound, the other to somehow be administered internally, though he hadn't yet determined how to accomplish this. The most difficult part came next. The raccoon approached the badger's wound cautiously, chittering softly as if to explain his intentions. The infection had worsened during his absence. The flesh around the gash was swollen and hot to the touch, the discharge thicker and more abundant. The badger's eyes flickered open briefly at his approach, clouded with pain, but somehow trusting, or perhaps simply too weak to object. Taking this as permission, the raccoon began cleaning the wound with his tiny paws, removing debris and dried blood with gentle, meticulous movements. He made several trips to the nearby stream, returning with water cupped in leaves to flush the wound clean. Each time the water made contact with the inflamed flesh, the badger's massive body would tense, a low growl rumbling in its chest. But remarkably, it made no move to stop the treatment, as if understanding on some primal level that this small creature was trying to help. When the wound was as clean as he could manage, the raccoon applied his plantain and resin poultice directly to the inflamed area, pressing it firmly into place with his paws. The badger flinched, a sharper growl escaping its throat, but still made no aggressive move. The raccoon worked quickly, covering the entire wound before the badger's patience could wear thin. Over the poultice, he placed a layer of the crushed mushrooms, then sealed the entire treatment with more pine resin to hold it in place. Next came the challenge of internal medicine. The raccoon crushed the remaining mushrooms into the smallest pieces possible, then mixed them with the honey he had risked so much to collect. The sweet substance would make the medicine palatable and, according to his mother's teachings, had healing properties of its own. He formed small balls of this mixture, then approached the badger's head, chittering softly to get its attention. The badger's eyes opened, unfocused and glassy with fever. The raccoon held the medicine ball to its mouth, pushing it gently against the closed jaws. For a moment, nothing happened, and the raccoon feared the badger was too far gone to cooperate. Then, slowly, the massive jaws parted, and a thick tongue emerged to investigate the offering. The raccoon remained perfectly still as the badger tasted the honey mushroom mixture, then accepted it, swallowing with visible effort before closing its eyes once more. As afternoon faded into evening, the raccoon continued his care. He brought water in cupped leaves, holding them to the badger's mouth, encouraging it to drink with soft touches to its muzzle. He gathered the softest moss he could find, creating a more comfortable bed beneath the injured animal. And every few hours, he checked the wound, applying fresh poultice when needed. The yarrow he had collected was brewed into a tea of sorts. Leaves steeped in stream water, held in a large curved piece of bark. Getting the badger to drink this bitter concoction proved challenging, but the raccoon persisted, understanding somehow that this might help fight the fever that raged through the larger animal's body. As twilight descended, painting the forest in shades of purple and blue, the raccoon's exhaustion caught up with him. He had not eaten all day, his own needs forgotten in the desperate effort to save his companion. Now, his small body trembled with fatigue, his eyes growing heavy despite his determination to maintain his vigil. He managed to forage quickly in the immediate vicinity of the clearing, finding a handful of berries and grubs that he consumed hastily before returning to the badger's side. By nightfall, something remarkable had occurred. The badger's breathing had steadied, becoming deeper and more regular. When the raccoon checked the wound, removing the poultice carefully, he found that the angry red lines that had been spreading from the wound seemed to have receded slightly. The discharge was less abundant, and the swelling had decreased noticeably. And most encouragingly, the badger had managed to lap up water on its own several times, even consuming 2 more of the honey mushroom medicine balls without prompting. Exhausted beyond measure, the tiny raccoon finally allowed himself to rest, curling up against the badger's side, his small body seeking warmth as the night air grew chill. As sleep claimed him, he felt the gentle pressure of the badger's massive paw coming to rest protectively over his small body, an acknowledgement of their unlikely bond, forged in the crucible of survival and compassion. Neither animal was aware of the pair of yellow eyes watching from the shadows, unblinking and calculating. Nor did they notice the silent figure that slipped away into the darkness after observing their interaction. Moving with purpose through the nighttime forest, carrying news of this strange alliance to others who would find it most interesting. In the darkness of that night, as the raccoon slept the sleep of the utterly spent, the badger's fever broke. Sweat soaked its fur, then gradually dried as its temperature returned to normal. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, the massive creature had shifted position slightly, no longer lying helplessly on its side, but curled more naturally, its breathing deep and even. Dawn brought new challenges and unexpected allies to the clearing, and with them, a test of loyalty that would shake the forest to its very foundations. For the yellow eyes that had observed them belonged to the most feared predator in the region, a creature whose interest in the raccoon and badger would set in motion events that would become legend among the forest dwellers for generations to come. The first light of dawn filtered through the forest canopy, casting dappled shadows across the clearing where the tiny raccoon and injured badger had spent the night. Golden beams illuminated particles of dust dancing in the air, creating an almost ethereal quality to the morning. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the sweet scent of wildflowers and the earthy aroma of damp soil after the recent rains. The tiny raccoon stirred, his body stiff from sleeping in one position throughout the night. His muscles protested as he stretched, extending his small limbs and arching his back in a motion that sent ripples through his silver-gray fur. He blinked away exhaustion, immediately turning his attention to the badger beside him, anxiety momentarily gripping his heart as he assessed his companion's condition. What he saw made his heart leap with cautious hope. The badger was no longer lying helplessly on its side, but had managed to curl into a more natural position, its massive body forming a semicircle with its head tucked slightly toward its chest. Its breathing was deep and regular, the labored gasps of the previous day replaced by the steady rhythm of healing sleep. The fever that had radiated from its body like heat from sun-baked stones had subsided, leaving behind the normal warmth of a large mammal. Most encouraging of all, when the raccoon carefully removed the poultice to examine the wound, he found the angry inflammation had subsided significantly. The discharge had dried, forming a protective crust, and the edges of the gash showed the first signs of knitting together. Thin bridges of new tissue spanning the gap that had previously gaped open like a second mouth in the badger's flank. The raccoon chittered softly in excitement, his paws dancing a little jig of relief on the forest floor. Tiny prints marked the earth as he moved in circles, unable to contain his joy. His ministrations had worked better than he could have hoped. Though the badger was far from healed, it had crossed the critical threshold from decline to recovery. The ancient knowledge passed down from his mother, knowledge he had feared lost to the recesses of memory, had proven effective when it mattered most. As if responding to the raccoon's celebration, the badger's eyes flickered open. Unlike the previous day, when they had been clouded with pain and fever, dull orbs reflecting only suffering, they now appeared clear and alert. Dark pools that took in the surroundings with careful assessment. The massive creature regarded the small raccoon with an expression that, had it been human, might have been described as bemused curiosity. There was recognition there, an acknowledgement of the raccoon's presence that went beyond mere awareness to something approaching understanding. Slowly, with obvious effort, the badger attempted to rise. Its first try ended in failure, its weakened legs buckling beneath its weight, unused to supporting its bulk after days of inactivity. A grunt of frustration escaped its throat as it collapsed back onto the soft bed of moss the raccoon had prepared. The raccoon darted forward, pressing against the badger's side as if his tiny body could possibly support the much larger animal. The gesture, futile as it was physically, seemed to encourage the badger. Its eyes met the raccoon's, and something passed between them, a silent communication, a shared determination. On its second attempt, the badger managed to rise to a half-sitting position. Its front legs braced firmly against the ground, while its hindquarters remained lowered. It panted with the exertion, its massive chest heaving, but there was triumph in its posture. It was undeniably improved from the day before, when even lifting its head had seemed beyond its capabilities. The raccoon's immediate concern turned to nourishment. The badger had gone days without food, surviving on the water and medicinal honey mixture the raccoon had provided. Recovery would require strength, and strength required sustenance, substantial sustenance for a creature of the badger's size. He scurried off into the forest, his small form disappearing into the underbrush with purpose driving each step. He returned shortly with a collection of edible roots and tubers he had hastily dug up from a patch of soft earth near the stream. His tiny paws were caked with dirt, evidence of his diligent efforts. These he presented to the badger, arranging them neatly within reach of its muzzle, stepping back with his head tilted expectantly, awaiting approval for his offering. The badger sniffed at the collection, its sensitive nose twitching as it assessed the raccoon's gift. After a moment's consideration, it looked at the raccoon with what could only be described as polite refusal. There was no aggression in the rejection, merely a biological incompatibility with the offering. Of course, the raccoon realized his mistake immediately, his ears flattening slightly against his head in embarrassment. Badgers were primarily carnivorous. These plant foods might sustain a raccoon with its omnivorous diet, but they would do little for a predator accustomed to meat. The badger needed protein to rebuild its strength, to repair the damaged tissue and replenish the blood it had lost. With new determination, the raccoon set off again, this time on a more challenging mission. He was no hunter by nature, preferring to scavenge or forage, but necessity drove him to attempt what would normally be beyond his capabilities. His usual diet consisted of fruits, nuts, insects, and the occasional egg or small fish. Prey that didn't require the speed and strength of a true predator. But today, he would need to channel skills he rarely used, to become something more than what nature had designed him to be. Near a fallen log at the forest's edge, where the dense woodland gave way to a small meadow dotted with wildflowers, the raccoon discovered a mouse nest. The subtle rustling beneath a pile of dried leaves betrayed the presence of the tiny rodents, their movements creating minute disturbances in their carefully constructed home. Moving with uncharacteristic stealth, his body low to the ground and his steps deliberate and silent, he managed to capture one of the adult mice as it emerged from the safety of its nest, dispatching it quickly with a bite to the neck. A skill he had observed but rarely practiced. The mouse went limp in his jaws, its life extinguished with merciful speed. The raccoon stood for a moment, the mouse dangling from his mouth, a complex mix of emotions washing through him. There was pride in his accomplishment, satisfaction at having secured food for the badger, but also a solemn acknowledgement of the life he had taken. The mouse was small, hardly a meal for a creature the badger's size, but it was a start, the beginning of the long path to recovery. Over the next several hours, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the forest awakened fully to the day's activities, the raccoon repeated this process. He moved from location to location, targeting areas where small prey would be abundant. His hunting improved with practice, his movements becoming more fluid, more confident. He gradually accumulated a small pile of fresh prey. 3 more mice from various locations, a young squirrel that had ventured too close to the ground in search of fallen acorns, even a frog from the nearby stream that had been too slow in its leap to safety. Each time he returned to the clearing, he would add his catch to the growing collection near the badger, chittering with pride at his accomplishments. The badger watched these proceedings with increasing interest, its eyes following the raccoon's movements, its nostrils flaring to catch the scent of fresh meat, a biological response that signaled returning health more clearly than any other sign. By midday, when the sun stood directly overhead and cast the shortest shadows of the day, the badger had managed to consume most of the raccoon's offerings. It ate slowly at first, its body relearning the process after days without food, but with increasing enthusiasm as its digestive system awakened. Its strength visibly returned with each small meal, the energy from the protein infusing its massive frame with renewed vitality. It had even managed to stand fully at one point, its legs steady beneath it for several heartbeats before it deliberately lay down again, clearly still conserving its energy for the healing process. The raccoon, satisfied with the badger's progress, turned his attention back to the wound. The previous poultice had dried and begun to flake away, having done its work through the night. He prepared a fresh application using the last of his gathered medicinal plants, the yarrow, plantain, and pine resin mixture that had proven so effective. His tiny paws worked with practiced efficiency now, mixing the components in precise proportions, the movements almost ritualistic in their careful precision. As he worked, applying the mixture with careful attention to every part of the wound, he became aware of a change in the forest around them. The birds, which had been calling to one another from the treetops all morning, had gone silent, their cheerful songs cutting off as if a great hand had swept them from the air. The usual rustling of small creatures in the underbrush had ceased. The constant background symphony of movement that was the forest's heartbeat suddenly stilled. An unnatural stillness had descended upon the clearing, a vacuum of sound that pressed against the ears like physical pressure. The badger sensed it too, its massive head lifting from where it had been resting on its paws, nostrils flaring as it sampled the air for information its eyes and ears couldn't provide. A low growl rumbled in its chest, starting deep within its barrel-like torso and emerging as a warning vibration that the raccoon felt through the ground beneath his paws. Despite its weakened state, the badger shifted its body, moving with deliberate purpose to place itself between the raccoon and the eastern edge of the clearing, the direction from which both animals sensed approaching danger. From the shadows of the dense underbrush, where the foliage grew so thick that little sunlight penetrated to the forest floor, a pair of yellow eyes appeared. They seemed to float, disembodied in the darkness for a moment, two amber lanterns hovering with unnatural steadiness. Then, as the creature moved forward, the eyes were followed by the sleek, powerful form of a mountain lion emerging from the vegetation. Each step was placed with deliberate precision, silent despite the dry leaves and twigs that should have announced its approach. The great cat padded into the clearing, its tawny coat gleaming in the midday sun like burnished gold, muscles rippling beneath the fur with each controlled movement. Its tail swished slowly from side to side, the only indication of the deadly focus of a predator assessing potential prey. The mountain lion was the apex predator of the forest, a solitary hunter whose territory spanned many miles and whose presence inspired terror in creatures both large and small. The raccoon froze, his small heart pounding against his ribs with such force he feared it might burst from his chest. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to scramble up the nearest tree where the mountain lion couldn't follow, to hide in the smallest crevice and wait for the danger to pass. Mountain lions rarely bothered with prey as small as raccoons, the effort not worth the meager reward. But in this case, he was not the obvious target. The badger, weakened by its injury despite its improvement, would present a tempting opportunity for the big cat, a substantial meal with less risk than usual. To the raccoon's astonishment, the badger struggled fully to its feet, rising with a determination that overrode its physical limitations. Its legs trembled with the effort, but it stood firm, presenting a defensive stance that spoke of years of survival in a harsh world. Despite its condition, it presented a formidable front, teeth bared in a snarl that revealed yellowed canines capable of crushing bone, claws extended and ready for combat. The message was clear. It would not be easy prey, regardless of its injured state. The raccoon, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand, one that defied the very essence of his survival-focused nature, positioned himself beside the badger rather than fleeing to the safety of the nearest tree. His tiny form was almost comical next to the badger's bulk, like a sapling growing in the shadow of an ancient oak. Yet there was nothing humorous in his stance, in the way his fur stood on end to make himself appear larger, in the uncharacteristic growl that emanated from his throat. He had committed to this alliance, this inexplicable bond, and he would stand with the badger, even in the face of certain death. The mountain lion stopped several yards away, its yellow eyes moving from badger to raccoon and back again with calculating assessment. There was intelligence in that gaze, not merely the instinctual programming of a predator, but genuine cognition, evaluation, and something else the raccoon couldn't identify. The great cat's tail continued its hypnotic swishing, the only movement in a scene otherwise frozen in tension. For long moments, the three animals remained in this tableau, a triangle of wildly disparate creatures connected by the invisible threads of fate and circumstance. The only movement was the steady rise and fall of their breathing and the occasional twitch of the mountain lion's tail. Birds watched silently from distant branches, small creatures remained hidden in their burrows, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented encounter would resolve. Then, to the utter bewilderment of both raccoon and badger, the mountain lion sat down on its haunches, its posture relaxing from predatory tension to something almost casual. The transition was so unexpected, so contrary to everything the smaller animals knew about the natural order, that neither could immediately process what they were witnessing. The mountain lion made a sound low in its throat, not a growl or a snarl, but something closer to a conversational rumble, as if it were attempting to communicate. The badger's aggressive stance faltered, confusion evident in the way its head tilted slightly to one side, in the partial lowering of its raised hackles. The raccoon, equally perplexed, remained pressed against the badger's side, ready to dart away at the first sign of attack, his small body vibrating with tension and uncertainty. But attack never came. Instead, the mountain lion rose again and approached slowly, each step deliberate and measured, its movements deliberately non-threatening, the antithesis of a predator's stalk. When it was within a few yards, close enough that both raccoon and badger could smell its wild, musky scent, it lowered its massive head and dropped something from its mouth onto the ground between them, a freshly killed rabbit, substantial enough to provide a real meal for the recovering badger. The rabbit's fur was still warm, its body limp but intact, clearly killed recently and with precision. With that offering made, the mountain lion backed away several steps, creating distance that signaled its peaceful intentions. Then it settled onto the ground, front paws extended before it in a sphinx-like pose, watching the badger and raccoon with that same inscrutable gaze. There was patience in its posture, a willingness to wait that spoke of purpose beyond the immediate moment. The raccoon and badger exchanged a look of mutual bewilderment, a shared moment of confusion that transcended the usual boundaries between their species. In all the long history of the forest, passed down through generations in the form of behavior and instinct, no one had ever witnessed or heard tell of a mountain lion bringing food to another predator. It defied every natural law, every understanding of how the world worked. Predators competed. They did not cooperate. They fought over territory and prey. They did not share resources. This was as fundamental to the forest's order as the rising of the sun or the changing of the seasons. Cautiously, the badger moved forward, its steps halting and uncertain, muscles tensed for immediate retreat should the mountain lion's behavior prove to be some elaborate trap. It reached the rabbit and claimed it, powerful jaws closing around the offering before dragging it back to where the raccoon waited. The mountain lion made no move to stop this, its amber eyes tracking the badger's movement with what almost appeared to be approval. Rather than consuming it immediately, however, the badger did something equally extraordinary. It used one massive paw to push a portion of the meal toward the tiny raccoon, an offering in return, acknowledgement of the small creature's role in its survival. The gesture was deliberate and unmistakable, a conscious decision to share resources rather than follow the selfish imperative of individual survival. The raccoon, after a moment's hesitation, accepted this gift, taking small bites of the rabbit's flesh while maintaining a wary eye on the mountain lion. The badger began to eat as well, tearing larger chunks with its powerful jaws, the fresh meat providing nutrients its body desperately needed for healing. The mountain lion remained in its sphinx-like pose, watching this shared meal with enigmatic patience. Occasionally, it would blink slowly, the only indication that it was a living creature rather than some strange statue placed in the clearing. It made no move toward the food it had provided, seemingly content to observe the unlikely pair. As the unlikely trio shared this strange communion in the sun-dappled clearing, the forest around them began to return to life. Birds cautiously resumed their songs, small creatures emerged from hiding, and the normal rhythms of woodland existence gradually reasserted themselves. Yet there was a difference now, a subtle shift in the energy of the place, as if the very fabric of the forest had been altered by this unprecedented alliance. None of them, not the tiny raccoon with his remarkable resourcefulness, not the badger with its stubborn resilience, not even the mountain lion with its inscrutable purpose, could possibly comprehend how this extraordinary convergence would reshape the destiny of the entire forest. They could not know that their unlikely bond, forged in the crucible of necessity and compassion, would be tested in ways none could imagine. For beyond the forest's boundaries, where the natural world gave way to human development, forces were gathering that would threaten not just their alliance, but the very existence of the woodland itself. As the day progressed toward afternoon, with sunlight shifting to the golden hues that preceded evening, the mountain lion finally rose from its position. It stretched languidly, powerful muscles extending beneath its tawny coat, then fixed the raccoon and badger with one last penetrating gaze. There was meaning in that look, purpose and intention that transcended the usual communication between wild creatures. Then, with the same silent grace with which it had arrived, the great cat turned and disappeared back into the forest, melting into the vegetation as if it had never been there at all. The raccoon and badger, left alone once more in the clearing, found themselves in a world fundamentally changed, not in its physical appearance, but in the invisible connections that defined their place within it. Something unprecedented had begun, something that defied the ancient laws of predator and prey, of competition and survival. What that something might become, only time would reveal. As twilight approached, bringing with it the first stars of evening, the badger settled back onto its bed of moss, its strength improved but not yet fully restored. The raccoon, exhausted by the day's extraordinary events, curled up beside it, his small body finding comfort in the larger animal's warmth. Together, they drifted into sleep, unaware that even now, the yellow-eyed mountain lion was moving with purpose through the darkening forest, setting into motion events that would soon draw them into a conflict far beyond anything their wild instincts had prepared them for. The following days brought remarkable changes to both the badger and the clearing that had become their temporary home. The badger's recovery accelerated with each passing sunrise, its massive body regaining strength at a pace that surprised even the optimistic raccoon. By the third morning after the mountain lion's visit, the badger was able to move around the clearing with only slight hesitation. Its gait almost returned to normal, save for an occasional favoring of its injured side. The wound itself had closed completely, leaving behind a puckered scar partially hidden by fur that was beginning to regrow. The raccoon continued to apply smaller amounts of medicinal poultice, more as a precaution than necessity now. his tiny paws working with practiced efficiency as he tended to his unlikely companion. Their routine had settled into a comfortable pattern. Mornings began with the raccoon checking the badger's wound, followed by a shared breakfast, sometimes from the raccoon's foraging efforts, but more often from mysterious offerings that appeared at the edge of the clearing overnight. Neither animal had seen the mountain lion since its first appearance, but the evidence of its continued interest was unmistakable. Fresh kills, rabbits, squirrels, even a young deer once, would be waiting for them, strategically placed where they couldn't be missed. On this particular morning, as golden light filtered through the canopy and birdsong filled the air, the badger did something unexpected. Rather than waiting for the raccoon to examine its wound as usual, it rose to its full height and gave itself a vigorous shake, as if testing the limits of its recovered body. Finding no pain or limitation, it turned to the raccoon with clear purpose in its dark eyes. With a motion of its massive head, it indicated the forest beyond their clearing, a clear invitation to venture forth. The raccoon hesitated, his head tilting in question. The badger repeated the gesture, this time with more insistence, then took several steps toward the trees before looking back expectantly. Understanding dawned on the raccoon. The badger was ready to leave, to return to its normal life and territory. A complicated mix of emotions washed through the East raccoon's small body. Pride at the successful recovery, satisfaction at a job well done, but also an unexpected sadness at the prospect of parting ways. He had grown accustomed to their strange companionship, finding comfort in the badger's solid presence after so many seasons of solitary existence. With a soft chitter of acknowledgement, the raccoon followed the badger to the edge of the clearing. There, to his surprise, the badger didn't continue onward, but instead lowered itself to the ground, indicating with another motion of its head that the raccoon should climb onto its back. The invitation was clear, but bewildering. The raccoon had never ridden on another animal before, had never even considered such a possibility. After a moment's hesitation, curiosity overcame caution. He scrambled up the badger's side, careful to avoid the healing wound, and settled himself between the powerful shoulders, tiny paws gripping the coarse fur for stability. The badger rose slowly, allowing the raccoon to adjust to this new arrangement, then set off into the forest at a deliberate pace. They traveled in silence, the only sounds the soft padding of the badger's feet on the forest floor and the occasional rustling of leaves overhead. Their journey took them deeper into the woodland than the raccoon had ever ventured on his own. They crossed streams and navigated dense underbrush, climbed rocky outcroppings, and traversed meadows dotted with wildflowers. Throughout it all, the badger moved with purpose, clearly following a predetermined path rather than wandering aimlessly. By midday, they arrived at the base of a steep hillside. Here, partially concealed by a curtain of hanging vines, was the entrance to a burrow, larger and more elaborate than any the raccoon had seen before. The badger paused at the entrance, allowing the raccoon to dismount before leading the way inside. The burrow opened into a surprising network of tunnels and chambers, a subterranean complex that spoke of years of excavation and refinement. The main chamber was spacious enough for the badger to turn around comfortably, with smaller adjoining spaces that appeared to serve different purposes: sleeping areas, food storage, even what looked like a crude drainage system to prevent flooding during heavy rains. In one corner of the main chamber, the raccoon noticed something unusual: a collection of objects that had no obvious practical purpose. Colorful stones, unusually shaped twigs, a fragment of blue glass worn smooth by time, even a tarnished human coin with unreadable markings. These treasures were arranged with evident care, each placed just so in relation to the others. The badger watched as the raccoon examined this collection, something like pride evident in its posture. Then, with deliberate movements, it used one massive paw to push forward a new addition to the arrangement. A small piece of the pine resin the raccoon had used in his healing poultice. The message was unmistakable, an acknowledgement of their shared experience, preserved among the badger's most valued possessions. Before the raccoon could fully process this gesture, a new sound reached them, a low rumble that vibrated through the burrow's earthen walls. Both animals tensed, the badger moving protectively in front of the raccoon as they faced the entrance. The mountain lion appeared in the opening, its large body blocking most of the light from outside. In the dimness of the burrow, its yellow eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light. It made no move to enter further, respecting the boundary of the badger's domain while making its presence known. A complex communication followed, not through words, but through a series of vocalizations, body postures, and scent markers that transcended the usual limitations of interspecies interaction. The raccoon, witnessing this exchange, understood only portions, but the general meaning became clear. The mountain lion had come with purpose, with warning. Something was happening at the edge of the forest, where the human settlement began. Strange machines had arrived, trees were being marked with bright colors, and the normal patterns of wildlife movement had been disrupted. Territory that had remained stable for generations was about to change, and not for the better. As the mountain lion completed its message, silence fell in the underground chamber. The badger's posture had shifted from defensive to contemplative, its massive head lowered in what appeared to be deep thought. The raccoon looked from one larger animal to the other, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully comprehending its implications. Finally, the badger raised its head and made a sound unlike any the raccoon had heard from it before. A determined bark that echoed off the earthen walls. The mountain lion responded with a low growl that somehow conveyed agreement rather than threat. Then, to the raccoon's astonishment, both larger animals turned to look at him expectantly, as if awaiting his input in this unprecedented council of forest creatures. In that moment, standing in the cool dimness of the underground chamber were the two most formidable predators of the woodland. The tiny raccoon realized that his life had changed irrevocably. Whatever was coming from the human world, whatever threat loomed on the horizon, he would face it not alone, but as part of something larger, an alliance that defied the natural order yet felt somehow right, as if the forest itself had orchestrated their unlikely convergence. As sunlight began to wane outside, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the three animals emerged from the badger's burrow with new purpose. The raccoon once again rode perched between the badger's powerful shoulders, while the mountain lion led the way through the gathering dusk. They moved as one unit now, their disparate sizes and natures unified by a common cause. Their destination, the edge of the forest, where the natural world met the human one, and where the battle for their home was about to begin. Dawn broke over the forest, with hesitant fingers of light that gradually pushed back the night's darkness. The trio, badger, raccoon, and mountain lion, had traveled through most of the night, stopping only briefly for rest and water. Now they crouched at the periphery of the woodland, concealed within the final line of underbrush that separated the ancient forest from what lay beyond. Before them stretched a landscape in transition, a battlefield where nature and human development waged their silent war. Yellow machines stood like sleeping giants in the early morning light, their metal bodies reflecting the sun's first rays. Trees lay fallen, their massive trunks stripped of branches and lined up like soldiers awaiting burial. Surveyor stakes with brightly colored flags marked boundaries and planned roads, creating an artificial geometry that contrasted sharply with the forest's organic patterns. The raccoon, still perched on the badger's broad back, felt his heart sink at the scale of the destruction. Even in his limited explorations near human settlements, he had never witnessed devastation of this magnitude. Entire sections of woodland that had stood for generations were now reduced to muddy clearings and piles of debris. A small encampment of temporary structures had been established at the center of the cleared area. Metal containers that served as offices and storage, portable toilets, and a gathering area where humans would presumably take their meals and plan the day's work. No humans were visible yet, but thin wisps of smoke rising from one of the containers suggested their arrival was imminent. The mountain lion signaled for them to retreat slightly, moving back into the denser cover of the forest before initiating another of their silent councils. Through a combination of subtle vocalizations, scent markers, and body language, the three animals exchanged information and impressions. The raccoon, with his experience of human behavior, contributed valuable insights. He recognized the patterns of development. This was not merely logging, but preparation for building. The markers suggested roads and structures, perhaps an extension of the nearby human settlement. Once completed, this development would not only destroy this section of forest, but would bring permanent human presence deeper into their territory. The badger's contribution focused on the underground implications, how the heavy machinery would compact soil, disrupt burrow systems, and potentially alter water flow beneath the surface. Many creatures that depended on these subterranean networks would be displaced or killed, even those not directly affected by the surface clearing. The mountain lion's concerns centered on territory fragmentation, how the development would create barriers to movement, isolate populations of wildlife, and disrupt hunting ranges for predators, like itself. The changes would ripple through the ecosystem, affecting every creature from the smallest insect to the largest mammals. As their council concluded, a new sound reached them, the rumble of approaching vehicles. Humans were arriving to begin another day of transformation. The three animals withdrew deeper into the forest, finding a hollow beneath an ancient oak where they could rest and formulate a plan. The raccoon, exhausted from the night's journey and the emotional impact of what they had witnessed, curled up in the protective curve of the badger's body and fell into a troubled sleep. His dreams were filled with falling trees and roaring machines, with forest creatures fleeing in panic as their homes disappeared beneath metal treads. When he awoke several hours later, the sun had reached its zenith. The sounds of destruction continued unabated from the clearing. The mechanical growl of engines, the crash of falling timber, the shouts of human workers coordinating their efforts. But something had changed in the atmosphere of their small sanctuary. There was a sense of purpose, of determination, that had not been present before. The badger and mountain lion had been joined by others. A pair of foxes, their russet coats vibrant against the forest's muted browns and greens, sat alert at the edge of the hollow. An owl, unusual in its daytime appearance, perched on a low branch overhead. Several deer, normally wary of predators, stood at a respectful distance, but clearly part of this gathering. Even smaller creatures, squirrels, rabbits, and various birds, had assembled, creating concentric rings around the three who had initiated this unprecedented coalition. The raccoon blinked in astonishment. Word had spread faster than he could have imagined, drawing creatures who would normally avoid each other into this impromptu assembly. Fear of the common threat had overcome natural enmities, at least temporarily. As he watched, the mountain lion rose and moved to the center of the gathering. With precise movements and vocalizations, it began to communicate the situation to the assembled creatures. The raccoon, still nestled against the badger, marveled at the great cat's ability to bridge the communication gaps between species. Though each animal understood only portions of the message directly, the essential information was conveyed through repetition and variation, through demonstration and emphasis. The message was clear. Their forest was being destroyed piece by piece and would continue to vanish unless they took action. No single species could stop the destruction, but together they might have a chance. The mountain lion proposed not direct confrontation, which would be futile against human technology, but a campaign of disruption and deterrence, using each species' unique abilities to make the development costly and difficult. As the mountain lion concluded, a remarkable thing happened. Each species, in its own way, signaled agreement. The deer stamped their hooves in unison. The foxes yipped their assent. The owl spread its wings in a display of commitment. The smaller creatures chattered and chirped their participation. Even the normally solitary badger huffed its determination to join this collective effort. The raccoon, overwhelmed by the historic nature of what he was witnessing, added his own chitter of agreement. In all the long history of the forest, nothing like this had ever occurred. Prey and predator, large and small, diurnal and nocturnal, all united by a common purpose. As the assembly dispersed to spread the message further throughout the forest, the original trio remained to develop the first phase of their strategy. The raccoon, with his knowledge of human objects and behaviors, would be crucial to this initial effort. The mountain lion would coordinate the larger animals, while the badger would organize those who lived below ground. That night, as darkness provided cover, they would begin their campaign to save their home. A campaign that would require all their courage, intelligence, and unity to have any hope of success. As the raccoon prepared for his role in the coming conflict, he reflected on the strange path that had led him to this moment. What had begun with an act of compassion for an injured badger had evolved into something far larger than himself. A movement that might determine the fate of the entire forest and all who called it home. The machines continued their work beyond the forest edge, unaware that the creatures they were displacing had decided to fight back. The battle for the forest was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again.